The human body is an extraordinary masterpiece of biological engineering under perfect conditions. It is a flawless machine. It can repair its own fractures. It can recalibrate its heart rate to survive oxygen-deprived altitudes. It can push far past what modern medicine defines as the absolute threshold of physical exhaustion. But a machine is only as durable as the environment it operates in. When you cross the invisible boundary line into the high, alpine wilderness, you enter a domain where human laws, human technology, and human mercy cease to exist. Nature does not negotiate. It does not care about your climbing experience. It does not care about your thousands of dollars in high-end technical gear, your survival training, or the depth of your courage in the high alpine peaks. Nature does not attack you with a sudden, single blow. It plays the long game. It uses the cold to slow your blood. It uses the isolation to break your mind. And it waits for you to make a single, microscopic mistake. In June of 1997, 25-year-old mountaineer Colby Coombs stepped onto the asphalt of an Alaskan airfield. He was young, exceptionally fit, and possessed a deep, reverent respect for the mountains. Alongside him were his two closest friends and climbing partners, men who had scaled some of the most dangerous rock faces on the continent. Their target was Mount Foraker, a brutal, 11,000-foot wall of jagged granite, sheer ice, and unpredictable weather systems, deep within the heart of the Alaska Range. To reach the base camp, they boarded a light, single-engine Cessna aircraft.
Lifeline 1-1, systems are green, ready for departure.
It was supposed to be a routine drop-off, a quick, 40-minute scenic flight across the white, jagged horizon as the aircraft lifted off. The civilization of Anchorage faded into a vast wilderness of rock and ice. Colby sat in the co-pilot seat, adjusting the straps of his 5-point harness, checking his technical watch, and looking out at the endless, dazzling white landscape below. He was completely at peace. He was a man entering his element, utterly unaware that he was staring directly into his own living graveyard. But mountain air is a deceptive, invisible enemy around massive, vertical geological structures. Air behaves like water rushing over a boulder. It creates hidden, violent phenomena known as mountain waves, massive, invisible downward air currents traveling at catastrophic speeds. A mountain wave does not give a pilot warning. It does not show up on radar. It catches a light aircraft from above with the force of a hydraulic press. It doesn't just push the plane down. It strips the wings of lift. It drops it out of the sky, turning a steady, peaceful flight into a sudden, vertical dive towards solid rock within seconds. The interior of the Cessna transformed from a quiet cabin into a screaming vortex of gravity. The controls went completely dead in the pilot's hands. The single propeller engine shrieked, burning fuel at maximum capacity as the pilot fought the downward draft. But the altimeter was spinning out of control, losing hundreds of feet per second. The sheer, vertical white wall of Mount Foraker rose up through the windshield, with terrifying speed at over 100 miles per hour. The light aircraft slammed directly into a sheer, vertical ice sheet. The impact was cataclysmic. The wings sheared off instantly, disintegrating into a cloud of aluminum shards and fuel vapor. The main fuselage became a bullet of twisted, shredding metal, rolling violently down a 300-foot precipice, crashing over jagged granite boulders, bouncing off ice shelves, and crumpling like a soda can, before settling into a deep, heavy, absolute silence, concussed, disoriented, trapped inside a freezing, dark cage of compressed aluminum. Hours passed before Colby slowly opened his eyes. The world was upside down. The blinding white glare of the high-altitude sun cut through the shattered windshield, reflecting off the jagged interior metal. The temperature inside the ruined cabin was already plummeting below -20 degrees. The sharp, toxic smell of leaking aviation fuel filled the frozen air, dripping onto the snow beneath the hull. He reached out with a trembling hand, trying to shake the shoulder of the man next to him. There was no movement, no breath, no heartbeat. The pilot and Colby's climbing partner had been killed instantly upon the initial impact. Their bodies were frozen, locked into the positions where they had spent their final seconds in a single heartbeat. Colby had gone from a member of an elite climbing team to a solitary ghost. He was completely, utterly alone, stranded at 10,000 feet on one of the most hostile, remote mountains on Earth. But the true horror of his reality was waiting for him to move as Colby tried to unbuckle his harness and push his weight out of the crushed metal debris. His body collapsed under a sudden, blinding wave of white-hot agony that caused his vision to black out. When his vision cleared, the medical reality he faced was catastrophic. The human body cannot survive an impact at that velocity without paying a severe price. The violent deceleration had fractured Colby's neck, cracking the vertebrae. It had completely shattered his shoulder blade, leaving his left arm entirely paralyzed and useless. A deep, jagged laceration split his face from his eyebrow to his jaw, pouring blood into his eyes that instantly froze into dark crusts in the Arctic air, and his ankle was completely crushed. The bone splintered inside his heavy climbing boot. He could not stand. He could not turn his head without risking total paralysis. He had no radio. The aircraft's communication array was a mess of severed copper wires. No rescue team in Anchorage knew they had crashed, because they were experienced climbers with a multi-day itinerary. A search party wouldn't even be assembled for at least another 5 days. Every standard survival protocol taught in mountaineering says to stay with the aircraft. The metal hull provides a visual target for search planes. It provides shelter from the wind. But Colby looked out through the torn fuselage at the horizon. The sun was dipping below the peaks, and a massive, dark wall of Arctic storm clouds was rolling across the valley. He calculated a brutal, mathematical truth. If he stayed inside this metal tomb, the approaching blizzard would drop the temperatures to -40. With his injuries, hypothermia would claim his life before the next sun rose to live. He had to leave the only shelter he had. He had to step out into the open void. He had to descend a 30-mile, crevasse-ridden glacier on a shattered ankle, with a broken neck, alone, using nothing but his raw will to crawl across the ice. Day 1 turned into day 2, then day 3. Time lost its meaning, measured only by the agonizing rhythm of survival, with his left arm paralyzed and his right ankle shattered. Colby had dragged himself out of the fuselage into the deep, powdery snow. He had managed to fashion a makeshift crutch out of a broken aluminum support pole he dragged from the plane's wreckage, tying it to his functional right arm with a piece of climbing webbing. Step by agonizing step, he dragged his broken frame across the white landscape. Every single time his boot struck the frozen ice crust, a white-hot electrical shock of pure agony shot up his leg, traveled through his shattered pelvis, and hit the fractures in his neck. His world shrank down to a space of 12 inches. The 12 inches of snow directly in front of his face, dragged the pole, moved the knee, slide the broken ankle, scream, repeat. Then, the mountains stripped away his vision. A blinding Arctic whiteout rolled across the glacier, swallowing the sun within minutes. Visibility dropped to less than 3 feet. The horizon vanished entirely. The sky above and the snow below merged into a terrifying, featureless, absolute void of white. In an alpine whiteout, your equilibrium fails. You cannot tell if you are walking uphill, downhill, or stepping directly off a vertical precipice. The glacier was a minefield of bottomless crevasses, massive cracks in the ice hidden by thin snow bridges. A single inch of miscalculation meant falling into a blue ice grave, where no one would ever find his body. As the physical trauma mounted, Colby's mind began to fracture. The combination of a severe concussion, extreme dehydration, and advanced hypothermia began to tear at the fabric of his sanity. The silence of the glacier became deafening, and his brain began to invent sounds to fill the void. He began to experience vivid, terrifying hallucinations. He heard the phantom voices of his dead friends laughing directly behind him in the wind. He saw neon corporate structures, warm cabins, and paved roads in the snow that vanished. The moment he crawled toward them, he was losing his grip on reality. He fell dozens of times. Every time his footing slipped on the black ice beneath the powder, his body slammed hard into the glacier. His fractured shoulder blade took the brutal, unyielding brunt of each impact, sending him into screaming fits of helpless agony on the ice, lying in the snow for 20 minutes at a time, just to gather the cognitive strength to lift his head back up. His thirst was a burning, chemical fire in his throat. He had no stove to melt ice, so he survived by eating raw snow, unaware that forcing his stomach to melt freezing water was dropping his core body temperature even faster, accelerating the onset of hypothermia by the 4th day. Colby's body was literally consuming itself to stay alive, burning through its own muscle tissue for energy. His cheeks were hollow and sunken. His skin was blackened, split by severe frostbite and blistering. Weeping sunburns caused by the intense ultraviolet glare reflecting off the glacial ice. His fingers were frozen stiff, locked like claws inside his tattered, frozen gloves, he no longer looked like a human being. He was a walking ghost, a shattered collection of broken bones operating entirely on a primitive, ancient, subconscious drive, the sheer, absolute refusal to allow the ice to take his life. On the final afternoon, trailing a dark path of blood behind him in the grey gravel, Colby crawled off the terminal moraine at the very base of the glacier. He had descended 30 miles of ice. He was on the verge of total multi-organ failure. His kidneys were shutting down from dehydration, his heart rhythm irregular from the cold. His eyes were swollen, nearly completely shut from snow blindness, staring through a dark, blurry haze. And then, through the mist, his mind registered an impossible shape, a high-altitude research tent. He tried to scream, but his vocal cords were completely dry, producing nothing but a silent, raspy gasp. He didn't have the energy to lift his arms to wave. He couldn't stand on his shattered ankle. He had nothing left. No fuel, no muscle, no adrenaline. He simply used the last remaining ounces of his physical weight to throw his body forward across the sharp rocks, inch by agonizing inch, dragging his tattered clothes through the dirt, until a researcher casually stepped out of a tent to check a weather gauge, looked down, and spotted a tattered, blood-soaked red jacket moving across the gravel, against every established law of medical science, against a fractured neck that should have paralyzed him, and a shattered body that should have given up days ago. Colby Coombs had beaten the mountain. He had dragged himself 30 miles across an Alaskan glacier to safety. When the military rescue helicopters finally arrived days later to retrieve the wreckage from the high peaks of Mount Foraker, the recovery teams stood on the glacier. They looked up at the immense, terrifying ice walls. They looked down at the endless miles of crevasses, avalanche paths, and vertical drops that Colby had navigated alone, in the dark, in a whiteout, with a broken body. And they realized that Colby hadn't just survived an aviation accident. He had conquered an unyielding environment through the single greatest force known to our species, an element that no laboratory can quantify, and no mountain can break: the unstoppable, infinite power of the will to live.